We start with the basically trash feedstock. It's a waste product. It needs no additional land to produce it. It's not competing with any food. It's actually much worse for the environment because it is decomposing as methane. And so, if we can capture that waste product and make it into aviation fuel, it is actually reducing CO2 emissions by much, much more than a regular HEFA product. And so, for the same kind of cost, you're getting a much greater environmental benefit.
Welcome to the latest episode of Sustainability in the Air. I am Dirk Singer, the head of sustainability at Simple Flying. With us today is Meg Gentle. She is the executive director at HIF Global. Meg spent her career building some of the largest infrastructure projects in the world. She was instrumental in making the USA the biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas on the planet. Now she's at HIF Global, a company that is producing synthetic fuels and one that has just entered the aviation space with a proposition that could change how airlines think about SAF procurement. We are recording this just as Sarah Week gets started in Houston, where HIF Global is hosting a working session examining whether RNG-based SAF can achieve a lower cost of abatement than HEFA, the pathway that dominates SAF supply today. In this episode, Meg takes us from the wind fields of Patagonia to the dairy farms of Texas and explains why HIF Global believes it can produce SAF at a lower cost per tonne abated than anything else on the market. Meg, thank you so much for joining us on the Sustainability in the Air podcast. We have a lot of topics to sort of cover today and to cover the HIF Global story, but why don't we start by talking about yourself? Now, you have a very long career, having built much of the natural gas industry in the US, having overseen billions of dollars in infrastructure. Now you've moved to HIF Global, working on synthetic fuels. What was the journey that you undertook? What drew you to the space? And how does it connect to the energy career that you've built?
Well, Dirk, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. And as you know, I started my career in the upstream sector and then moved into liquefied natural gas and had the good opportunity to create the foundation for what now is the US as the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. And so really over that time period, and we were involved in Freeport LNG, Sabine Pass, Corpus Christi, and now Woodside's plant that's under construction, Woodside, Louisiana LNG. And over that time, I really developed this kind of passion for developing new things, right? And trying to see where energy needs to go and how we can create new markets to make that happen. And that means not just the market for the different kind of energy or fuel itself, but actually new commercial structures, new financing structures that make it work. And so it was sort of an easy transition then as we started looking to, all right, now we've established the LNG market. What has to be the future of fuels? And how can we use new and innovative ways to produce them? And that's how I ended up with the e-fuels business.
Okay, amazing. So you're now at HIF Global. HIF Global is operating at a pretty remarkable geographic scale. So you have been producing e-fuels in southern Chile for a number of years. You've got projects developing in Uruguay and Texas, and you're also looking in Australia. Maybe kind of take us on a tour around the world of your different projects. What's happening where? What stages are they at? How do the different locations serve different markets? And also, what decisions come to pass when you're choosing a specific geography or a particular location?
Well, as in many things in life, you start from necessity.
Okay.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so the journey of HIF Global began in Chile, where there is a tremendous wind resource in the southern part of Chile. So Patagonia actually has the best wind in the world, that
Mm,
it blows so consistently and with such dense air that the turbines can operate at a very, very high capacity factor, over 70% capacity
right.
factor, compared to what's considered good wind in the world, about 40% capacity factor. But there is very little population, very little industry in southern Patagonia. So even if you can generate the electricity, what will you do with it? So we started imagining, okay, how do we convert this renewable energy into a fuel that can be transported on ships and delivered to markets that need them. And that is how the e-fuels value chain started. And e-fuels was envisioned by other people in the world, and we had technology providers that came as our partners to be able to build Haruoni, which was the first operating e-methanol and e-gasoline facility
Right.
there on the Straits of Magellan.
And of course, I guess Chile was. I mean, I know that the Chile markets itself as having the world's cheapest green hydrogen. Or that is certainly their ambition, which I'm sure was one of the reasons that you chose it. And also, the point about the renewable energy not being used. That's one of the criticisms I know that the synthetic fuel industry gets is that could this renewable energy be used somewhere else? But of course, the point you're making is it wouldn't be used anywhere if you weren't actually making use of it.
That's exactly right. So it's maybe useful to then explain, okay, we take the renewable electricity and what? How does it become a fuel?
Right.
So that electricity is used to power the energy needed for electrolyzers, and electrolyzers
Hmm.
separate hydrogen from water.
Yep.
And then we deliver recycled carbon dioxide to the facility, and we attach the hydrogen and the carbon dioxide together in a process called synthesis. And that
Hmm.
makes hydrogen, carbon, hydrocarbon, basically a synthetic hydrocarbon that's chemically identical first to methanol. And then the methanol, we use another round of synthesis at Haruoni to make gasoline. But you can use methanol almost like we use crude oil today to make anything. You can
Mm.
synthesize that into gasoline, diesel. We make a little bit of LPGs, so propane butane mix, um, jet fuel, anything that we use fossil fuels for today. And so you have a very versatile value chain. And we took that and we said, okay, how can we develop a portfolio approach to this business around the world?
Right. Okay. So you mentioned let's just stop on e-methanol for a second. Now, obviously, you're going down the e-methanol route, which only a minority of synthetic fuel companies are going down. Most are down the eSAF Fischer-Tropsch route. Explain to us kind of the benefits of methanol over the more conventional eSAF route that other providers have got.
Yes, one advantage is the versatility of methanol. As I
Mm.
said, we can use it to, well, you can use methanol itself as a marine fuel or in the chemical industry or as a blending agent into gasoline and other fuels. You can also take methanol and synthesize it into aviation fuel, diesel, gasoline. So it's a very, very versatile molecule. And when you produce the methanol, you have full methanol production that can then make a combination of fuels, or you can make all jet fuel or all gasoline. So you get a very, very high jet fuel yield, for example. Whereas with the Fischer-Tropsch process, you have more
Mm.
of a distribution of fuels that you have to market.
Okay. So that's so you've talked us through Chile. Now, talk us through the other locations: Uruguay, Texas, Australia, and other places around the world that you're looking at.
Yes, all of these places far from each other, but they have some common themes, and there's a logic to the madness, if you would. And that is
Okay.
that we said, okay, what have we learned from Chile? We know all the elements that we need in an ideal site. We need
Mm.
access to a low cost electricity, renewable electricity. We need access to CO2 supply. We need access to some water. We need a community that wants the project to be there where we can bring economic benefit to the community. And we like having access to either local market or export market so we can use both. And so where are those elements in the world? We have a lot of expertise obviously in South America. So there was a natural movement to seeking things in Uruguay. We also have a position at the port of Açu in Brazil. Um, and we found a lot of the elements in Texas. So we have a couple sites in Texas. Also, Australia, access to very good renewable power. And we have a couple of other places in the world that we're sort of moving through this geographical diversity model. And as you know, things are always changing in all of these places, right? What's the underlying market conditions in your location? What is the underlying regulation that's supporting or enabling the market? And those are changing all of the time. So we decided
Mm.
the best approach is to have some geographical diversity so that we know we can provide, highly reliable production and access the market from different places.
Okay. So at what stage are these different projects at? I mean, obviously your Chile facility, your Patagonia facility's been running for a number of years. What will likely be next to come on stream out of Uruguay? You mentioned Uruguay, Brazil, Texas, and Australia.
We have been prioritizing Texas and Uruguay as kind of
Mhm.
the next two leading. And on any given day, I think, wow, Brazil is racing forward. We also got our environmental permits to expand the facility in Chile. So
Okay.
other things are catching up, and in fact, we have some others in the pipeline that I would say were several years back that are also catching up. So it's hard to make. I don't know if we want to be betting men on it yet, but we are prioritizing Uruguay and Texas.
Okay, amazing. So your facility in Patagonia, that's been operating for you for a few years. What have you learned from producing e-fuels at scale that you couldn't have learned from engineering studies alone?
Two actually really interesting things. One is that there are so many follow on local benefits and local demand that grow out of having a facility in production. And in Chile, it was particularly dramatic because we did not see very much of a local market because there's just not a lot of population there. But as the facility came online, the community is very proud of it. Chile, as a nation, is very proud of it and really wants to keep more and more of the fuel in Chile. So either use it in the local market or even farther north in the country. And so we've had tourist groups use the fuel, taking tourists to Antarctica. We've had a little bit the Chilean Navy. Of course, we sell all the LPGs, or we call them LGs because they're not actually petroleum. So the LGs there in the local market, and that has been really rewarding. And which brings us to sort of our next learning is that in order for sometimes the fuel to be used in the local market, which may be more price sensitive locally than,
Hmm.
some other more developed carbon markets in the world, we need to be developing more carbon pricing credit authorizations or certifications for fuel projects just the same as other projects. And that will greatly, greatly enhance the efficiency of the logistics delivering fuel to market and reduce the cost. Why do we need to transport the fuel all the way far away if
Mm,
we can sell to the customer far away an environmental attribute that they need to buy
sure.
and allow the local market to use the actual fuel? So, I would say that those were two a little bit unexpected learnings that we're really trying to incorporate into the other project design.
So let's move on to talking about aviation. So why aviation and why now? So started with, or you're known previously for road transport and marine fuels. Aviation is a newer territory. What made you decide this was the right moment to bring your proposition to the airline market?
Well, we've been really deliberate actually to think about how do we build the company as a portfolio company? And portfolio in several aspects. So we talked a moment ago about geographic portfolio and having some that diversity of location. And then there's also product portfolio.
Hmm.
And so we always knew, okay, we're serving the transportation market, and great benefits of e-fuels is that they're drop-in fuels. so we can use all of the existing infrastructure around the world. And so eventually we would like to serve road, marine, and aviation. And we started with road, and Porsche joined us as a partner. They're an equity owner of HIF Global.
You actually do tours with Porsche cars in Chile, is that correct?
Yes, we have had some great tours.
Yes. I've seen those videos.
Highest elevation that a car has ever driven happened with Porsche in the mountains of Chile using HIF's e-fuel.
Okay.
So that
Amazing.
was a record-breaking event.
Excellent. Excellent. But we digress from Porsche back to aviation.
Yeah, so Porsche was the beginning
Hmm.
of the road transport value chain, right?
Right.
So that we put together us as the producer, logistics, and then market. And then we
Hmm.
went to maritime and we put together the value chain with our Japanese investors to have us as the producer, Idemitsu, MOL for logistics, and moving into the maritime market. So the next was, how can we put the value chain together for aviation? And how do we want to bring methanol to make eSAF, where we deliver methanol? Either we can make SAF at our production location, or it may be more efficient to deliver methanol to a refinery and use existing refinery footprint to make jet fuel. And then it
Hmm.
can get blended into the existing jet fuel distribution system, and we deliver sustainable aviation fuel.
Right. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that you're not coming to the aviation market with a single proposition or a single pathway. So you are, as I understand it, you're pursuing both RNG-based SAF, mainly for the US market, and then you have the e-methanol-to-jet for other markets. Can you just walk us through why you are looking at these different approaches and how this came about?
All things come from necessity, right? And
Okay.
so it makes sense from places where we can be large wholesale methanol producers, that
Mhm.
that also is methanol qualifying as RFNBO in the European market. So qualifying as a renewable fuel of non-biological origin that we can deliver to European refineries and have eSAF, which meets all the eSAF sub-quota requirements for those like lowest carbon, cleanest fuels. But coming from the United States, because we touch the electric grid and also the natural gas pipeline grid, there are elements of the US production market that mean we don't qualify for those highest quality certifications in Europe. So we sort of scratched our head then on US production. Are there different ways to use less electricity coming from the US? We have a lot of pressure on electricity prices today from all of our data
Sure.
center activity. How could
Yep.
we do something to make the SAF with far less electricity use and take advantage of sort of the natural grid resource of the US? And that is what led us to renewable natural gas. And renewable natural gas is basically methane, just like natural gas that you use today in your home, but it
Hmm.
comes from waste products. So either dairy manure or trash or food waste that are otherwise decaying and emitting methane into our atmosphere. And that methane is relatively easy to collect. It can be
Hmm.
transported on the robust pipeline network in the United States. And then we can use that waste, which is pretty like high global warming pollution, in order
Yes.
to make aviation fuel.
So you gave us a very good basic explanation of how the e-methanol to SAF works. Can you just kind of, for people who might not be that familiar, just give a very brief layperson's non-technical explanation about how that feedstock you've just mentioned, how that becomes sustainable aviation fuel?
Yes. So you asked me before about Fischer-Tropsch.
Yes,
Fischer-Tropsch is, as many people know, a technology that's been in use for more than a century.
that's right.
And it can take natural gas and transform that into And actually, when you're going natural gas to kerosene, you get a very high yield of kerosene, not as much of a distribution. And kerosene is jet fuel. So all of whether it's jet fuel that we have or sustainable aviation fuel, all of that is actually kerosene. It's just where is it sourced from? But it has to become kerosene at pretty pure levels in order to meet the very rigorous aviation certification requirements that the fuel is the quality that we need for airplane engines.
Okay. Now, we're recording this just before Sarah Week in Houston, where you are hosting a working session. And that's going to be examining whether RNG-based SAF can achieve a lower cost of abatement than HEFA. That's quite a provocative argument. And I wonder if you could explain in plain terms what makes the economics different.
Yes. And Dirk, I'm glad you mentioned the Zero Week.
Mm.
What an incredible conference bringing together energy from all over the world and from all over the energy sector: electricity, oil and gas, new energies, future fuels, renewable energies. Everybody really is here in Houston to talk about how we move energy forward in order to support the growing needs we have in the world and the greatly expanding demand. So it was a perfect place to try to convene kind of a workshop to
Hmm.
invite people to sit with us and try to work through how can we actually make RNG based SAF come into the market as a commercial product. And we do think that we can produce it at a lower cost of CO2 abatement than HEFA. And the reason why is because we start with the basically trash feedstock. It's a waste product. It needs no additional land to produce it because it's already here today. So it's not competing with any food. And because it is a waste, it's actually much worse for the environment because it is decomposing as methane. And when methane goes into our atmosphere, it has a much higher warming effect on the earth than just pure CO2. And so, if we can capture that waste product and make it into aviation fuel, it is actually reducing CO2 emissions by much, much more than a regular HEFA product, which is basically made from used oils.
Right.
And so for the same kind of cost, you're getting a much greater environmental benefit. Or said the opposite way, for the same environmental benefit, you have a much lower cost.
Right. And I guess also, I mean, you've touched upon this, the sort of the availability of feedstock. I mean, here in the UK, where I'm based, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this sort of the provisional SAF mandate figures, came out very, very recently, which showed that, that 100% of the UK's, SAF production and SAF usage in 2025 was heifer-based, in particular used cooking oil-based, and 70% of that came from China. And of course, you have to ask questions about, whether, what the wisdom is of shipping a sort of a feedstock like that halfway around the world. Whereas what you're offering is, a feedstock that is abundant and, geographically anywhere. Just
Yes, exactly. And an additional sort of benefit of making the RNG model work in the US
Hmm.
is that the US natural gas pipeline network is already very, very robust. And so the collection of the waste methane can very easily go onto the pipeline network to get to the coast where you can build the plant, and then you have ready access to the market. And that is a little bit unique with the US system, where many places in the world we have, waste and trash and dairy products, but with a less ready ability to actually collect it and transform it.
Okay. So a lot of this, as I understand it, rests on carbon intensity scores of dairy RNG feedstock with scores as low as, minus 300 or 400. What that means when you blend with conventional jet fuel. Why is that so significant for airline buyers, and why isn't it better understood yet? Maybe talk us through that point.
Yeah, and I think that many people who are our audience today will will kind of know these things. But for any new viewers, fossil fuel kind of CI score, so carbon intensity score, is
Hmm.
generally in let's just call it 90 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And so there's uh, for fuels that are good CI scores, generally they're achieving maybe a 70% reduction. So they're around 30 grams of CO2 per megajoule. And e-fuels reduce it further than that. So, like an e-SAF would be roughly between 0 and 10 grams of CO2 per megajoule. Something that's made from renewable natural gas, because it's not just reducing CO2, it's reducing methane. It can have a very negative CI score. And coming from trash, it's maybe negative 30 grams of CO2 equivalent. Coming from
Okay.
manure, it's then, like you said, could be negative 300 or 400 grams. And traditionally, in regulation that's been set up, there was not an anticipation really of collecting the manure based methane and being able to make it into a fuel. So there are just sort of general limitations that we won't consider CI scores less than 0. And this is an education that we all have to do with the market, with our policymakers. There are some markets that do accept the negative score. California is actually one of those markets. And California is a carbon market that has been in operation since the 1990s and uses a very robust, the GREET model many people have familiarity with. And so this is where I think the market's just not knowledgeable on steeply negative CI scores because most of the SAF is HEFA SAF, which is
Right.
more kind of a 30 grams of CO2 equivalent.
Hmm.
And so we need to launch this. And it's so great that we're able to do this together this week and really try to bring this new product to the market.
Okay. So let's pivot back to e-SAF and to e-methanol. And we talked very, very briefly earlier about mandates. And so on the European side, obviously, you mandate, as you know, it's mandating synthetic fuel subquotas from 2030. Now, you recently signed offtake agreements with German companies for e-methanol from your forthcoming Uruguay project. How does that supply chain work? So e-methanol produced in South America and then converted to jet fuel for European compliance.
Yes. So we produce the e-methanol in South America.
Hmm.
And what we would like to do is deliver that to Europe or the UK, actually. You're sitting in the UK.
Yep, of course.
And partner with an existing refinery there that makes jet fuel today, and has distribution systems straight to the airport. And we will have to install in the refinery a synthesizer, so just a piece of equipment that takes the methanol and further synthesizes it or converts the molecules into kerosene. And then that production will get mixed with other SAF production or other regular fossil fuel jet fuel production. And for people that don't know very much about SAF, the SAF that is used today in the airplane is actually already blended with traditional jet fuel
Right.
because the highest that we're allowed by the regulators is to blend 50%, 50/50. And most SAF today is actually 30% HEFA SAF and
Hmm.
70% traditional fuel. So we would do that blending process at the refinery or right next door, depending how the logistics work today. And then that blending facility already has the ability to deliver to the airport. It goes to the airport, which is where the airline actually uses the SAF and loads it onto the airplane.
Okay. So let's zoom out to 10 years' time, so 2035 or 2036 rather. So it's a period when we can see SAF mandates escalating worldwide. I mean, not only the EU and the UK, but other countries, Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, Japan have started with their own mandates. hydrogen electric propulsion will still largely be confined to shorter routes, and airlines will be building long-term fuel portfolios. Give us your view of what the landscape will look like in 10 years' time, for the fuel mix of a major airline, and where do e-fuels and SAF in a broader sense fit into that picture?
Yeah, I think airlines over time clearly will be using more sustainable aviation fuel as part of their overall mix. I don't
Mm,
think that they will be very concerned, well, is this HEFA or is this eSAF or is this RNG SAF? We will move more to a system where there's simply this is the aviation fuel and this is the CI score of that aviation fuel.
right.
Right? And so we can standardize everything just on the carbon intensity score, which means that we can sell the product on sort of a dollars per CO2 abated basis, right? And then we don't have to be so specific. Well, hi, I'm marketing eSAF. I can just sell the CI score. We'll still have to work within some of the EU mandates and UK mandates in that market,
Mm,
which those are set in order to incentivize the beginning of the market. And so as we evolve, we may not require so many mandates. We just are knowing that we have to reach CO2 emissions reduction. And so I think we move to a world where we have multiple kinds of SAF that get produced and they get blended in, and the airline is able to purchase sustainable aviation fuel at the airport and rely on the distribution systems that we've all invested in and set up in order to get it there.
So, I mean, overall, would you say that you're an optimist when it comes to sort of to aviation meeting its SAF requirements and meeting its decarbonization journey? Because obviously there's a lot of debate that, especially as we get, post 2030, whether the supply is really there to sort of to meet the demands, both in terms of the mandates and beyond.
I think that I'm always an eternal optimist.
Right. A good thing to be.
And I think that the success that we have as an industry is going to rely very largely on how overall our entire ecosystem, and who is our ecosystem? Fuel producers, logistics, consumers, regulators, policymakers, environmental NGOs. We have to let industry just do it, right? Let everybody come with all of the solutions. Don't be too overly prescriptive with too many rules, right? And let's really, really go after reducing CO2 emissions in all the ways that we can do it. We need all of the ways. There's no one way that is the perfect silver bullet. Everyone has to come with all of the ways. But if we really enable that to happen, industry has like an incredible amount of ingenuity, innovation, and the young
Mm,
people that are coming into our sector, they're so passionate about getting it done, and that's what,
absolutely.
like, leaves me totally optimistic that we can do it.
Okay. So that's what gives you confidence. But from your experience and the many projects you've been involved in projects like this, and when it comes to scaling up SAF, what are the hard parts that people underestimate in the industry? What are the things that people miss, and what are the pitfalls that might not be so obvious that we need to look out for?
Yeah, I think that people really underestimate the the need for long-term certainty. And this is a real challenge as we're trying to develop these markets, right? Because governments today, we see them, they're sort of struggling because they can only commit their government time period,
Hmm.
right? And so for regulation, then it's very difficult to get long term certainty. And for long term, we all have different definitions of long term. Long term
Right.
in our business is like 15 or 20 years. And it doesn't mean we need fixed things. We just need to know we've got stability in the rules of the game. And so one sort of idea that I'll put out there that would help us a lot is if regulation could accept, we call it a grandfathering concept. Sometimes
Hmm.
that has negative understandings, but it needs some early mover protection. Yeah. To say, when you start construction on a project, if these are the rules of the game, you keep those rules for 10 to 20 years of your production. That would allow governments to still change the rules for projects that come after that, if that's required as we're learning. But I think that's the biggest thing that people underestimate is that we, on the industry side, we really struggle with changing rules all the time.
Right, absolutely.
Yes. So we have to have flexibility to change the rules, but you've got to give some early mover protection to let people get started.
Okay, amazing. And then final question. So for airline fuel buyers, corporate sustainability teams, and really anyone trying to navigate the SAF landscape, what do you want them to take away from this conversation? And also, we talked about Sarah Week. For those that are there for this week and want to continue the conversation, how can they connect with your team?
I want everyone to know that HIF Global can produce SAF, and we can do it at a lower cost than HEFA on a CO2 abated basis.
Hmm.
And we're looking for customers and really value chain partners that can come together and build this part of our portfolio with us to be able to deliver that to the market. And I think we're easy to reach and find. We have a
Yep.
website, hifglobal.com. We're on LinkedIn. We have active people on LinkedIn making sure that we're answering inquiries. Of course, at Zero Week, we're in the Agora with a meeting room and several people speaking in the pods. So we are here and we are trying to work with everyone in the ecosystem to get feedback on what needs to be done to get to the final step.
Meg, that's been a really fascinating conversation, from the wind turbines of Patagonia to the economics of RNG-based SAF in the United States. Thank you for taking us through your personal journey and HIF Global story, and I look forward to seeing how all of this develops over the next few years. Meg Gentle, Executive Director at HIF Global, thank you for joining us on Sustainability in the Air. That was Meg Gentle, Executive Director at HIF Global, joining us on Sustainability in the Air. And what struck me about this conversation is that HIF Global isn't just bringing another SAF pathway to market, they're challenging the assumption that HEFA is the cost benchmark. So whether you're an airline fuel buyer, a corporate sustainability lead, or just trying to make sense of whether the SAF market is heading, that's an argument worth paying attention to. You can find out more about HIF Global at hifglobal.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Sustainability in the Air wherever you get your podcasts.